The woman woke up before sunrise, as she always did. Her small house was quiet, except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. The sound was slow and steady, like it had been for years. She sat on the edge of her bed, wrapped in a thin shawl, and listened to the morning air move through the open window. Outside, the street was calm. A few dogs slept near the corners. A vegetable cart would pass soon, and children would later run by on their way to school. It was an ordinary day, and she expected nothing more than silence and routine. She moved slowly, careful with her steps, and prepared a simple breakfast. A cup of tea, a piece of dry bread. Nothing fancy. She had learned long ago not to expect much from life. The walls of her home were plain, the paint faded in many places. The furniture was old, but clean. Everything had its place, and nothing had changed for a long time. Change had stopped visiting her house years ago, as she sat at the small table. She looked toward the closed door of the inner room. Her eyes rested there for a moment longer than usual. That room was different. She rarely entered it now. Not because she forgot, but because it carried weight. Memories lived there, and memories were heavy. Still, she made sure the door stayed locked, as it always was. Outside, the day slowly woke up. A distant horn. A man calling out prices. Footsteps passing by. The woman finished her tea and washed the cup. She folded her shawl and placed it on the chair. Then she sat by the window and watched the street, her favorite way to pass time. She noticed a vehicle stop at the end of the road. It was not something that usually came there. Dark in color. No noise at first. She felt a small tightening in her chest. Not fear exactly, but a sense she knew well. The kind that told her something was about to disturb the quiet she had protected for so long. She had felt it before, many years ago, when people knocked on her door with questions and left with threats instead of answers. The vehicle doors opened. Several people stepped out. Their movements were fast and serious. They spoke to each other in low voices. One of them pointed toward her house. Her heart beat a little faster now. She stood up, her hands slightly shaking, and moved away from the window. Before she could reach the door, there was a loud knock. Not a polite one, not a patient one. It echoed through the small house, hitting the walls like a warning. She froze for a moment. Another knock followed, harder this time. She opened the door slowly. They did not wait for an invitation. The door was pushed open wider, and they stepped inside. Their shoes brought dust onto her clean floor. Their eyes moved quickly, scanning everything. One of them showed a paper briefly, but she could barely read it before it was lowered again. They said they had questions. They said it would not take long. Their voices were firm, official, and cold. She nodded without speaking. Words felt unnecessary. She had learned that silence was safer. They spread out across the house. One opened drawers. Another looked under the bed. One more stood near the door, watching her closely, as if she might suddenly run or hide something. But she did neither. She simply stood there, her back straight, her face calm. One of them asked if she lived alone. She nodded. Another asked if anyone visited her often. She shook her head. They exchanged looks, as if her answers confirmed something they already believed. The house offered them little. There was nothing new, nothing valuable, nothing suspicious, just an old life quietly lived. The tension in the room began to change. It was no longer sharp, but uneasy, like they were missing something. Then one of them noticed the locked door. "What's in there?" he asked. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. "Just old things," she said softly. They moved closer to the door. One of them tried the handle. It did not open. He looked at her again, this time more closely. She met his eyes. There was no panic there, only something deeper. Something tired, they asked for the key. She hesitated. Not because she was deciding whether to obey, but because she knew what would happen once that door opened. There was no turning back from truth. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. She reached into a small drawer and took out an old key. The metal was worn smooth. She held it for a second, feeling its familiar weight, then handed it over. The door opened with a slow creak. The room was dim. The curtains were drawn, letting in only thin lines of light. The air smelled of old paper and time. As they stepped inside, their footsteps slowed. Their voices stopped. The wall across from the door was covered from top to bottom. At first glance, it looked like chaos. Papers pinned unevenly. Photographs in black and white, some faded, some torn at the edges. Handwritten notes. Newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Strings connecting one piece to another. Dates written in careful ink. Names crossed out. Faces circled. The room fell silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Their earlier confidence faded, replaced by confusion and something close to respect. This was not a random collection. It was organized, thoughtful, purposeful. One of them stepped closer to the wall. He leaned in to read a note. His expression changed. Another followed. Soon all eyes were on the wall, tracing lines, reading words, recognizing symbols. "What is this?" someone finally asked. The woman stood at the doorway, her hands folded. "That," she said quietly, "is my life." They turned to look at her. For the first time, they really saw her. Not just as an old woman in a small house, but as someone who had carried something heavy for a very long time. She took a step into the room. The light touched her face, showing lines carved by years of waiting, watching, and remembering. She pointed to one photograph near the center. It showed a group of people standing together, unaware they were being captured in a moment that would later matter. "I was there," she said. "I saw what happened. I heard what was said." The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were listening. One of the officers asked why she never came forward. She smiled faintly, not in humor, but in understanding. "I did," she replied. Many times, she explained how her words were dismissed, how doors closed, how warnings followed, how her name slowly disappeared from records. She spoke without anger. The anger had burned out long ago, leaving only truth behind. The wall was her answer to being silenced. Every paper was a memory saved. Every photograph was proof that someone, somewhere, would one day look and understand. Outside, the street continued as usual. People passed by, unaware that inside this small house, something important had been uncovered. One of the officers lowered his voice. "You knew this day would come?" She nodded. "That's why I kept the wall ready." The raid had ended, but something else had begun. The people who burst into her home no longer stood as enforcers. They stood as witnesses. And the wall, silent for decades, had finally been seen. As they left the room, none of them looked at her the same way again. And she, standing there in the soft light, knew that the quiet she had lived in was about to change forever. The room stayed quiet long after her words settled in the air. No one rushed her. No one interrupted. The walls seemed to hold their attention, pulling them closer one piece at a time. It was not fear they felt now, but something heavier, responsibility. One of them gently touched the edge of a photograph, careful not to damage it. The picture showed a narrow street from many years ago. A crowd stood in the background. In the front, a moment was frozen that did not look important at first. But the date written beneath it changed everything. It matched an incident still spoken about in whispers. Another officer moved his eyes along the string, connecting that photo to a newspaper clipping. The headline was faded, but the words could still be read. It spoke of an event that was officially labeled as an accident. But the notes written in the woman's careful handwriting told a different story. They began asking questions, softly this time. Where did she get the papers? How did she keep them safe all these years? Did anyone else know? She answered slowly. Some things came from public places, collected before they disappeared. Some were given to her by people who were afraid to keep them. Others were copied by hand late at night when she was younger and braver. She explained how she hid items inside old books, behind loose bricks. Even inside clothing she never wore. She spoke as if she were talking about ordinary chores. But her hands told another story. They shook slightly when she pointed to certain parts of the wall. Those were the memories that hurt the most. One officer asked her why she never destroyed the wall if it brought her so much pain. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because pain is lighter than regret, she said. That sentence stayed with them. They noticed how carefully everything was placed. Dates followed a line. Events led into consequences. Faces appeared again and again, sometimes with notes added later in a different ink, showing how time had revealed more truth. It was not just a wall. It was a record. A quiet investigation that never stopped. One of them stepped back to look at the whole thing. You knew someone would come, he said. She nodded. Truth has a way of asking to be seen. They asked her how she survived all these years alone. She smiled faintly. She said she learned how to disappear without leaving. She avoided attention. She kept her life small. She trusted very few people, and she listened more than she spoke. As they talked, one officer stepped out of the room and made a call. His voice was low, careful. When he returned, his face was tense. He did not share details, but the woman understood. The truth always wakes up other forces. They told her they needed to document everything. To take pictures? To make copies. She agreed, but only after one request. Nothing was to be removed without her presence. She had guarded this wall alone for decades. She would not let it be scattered now. They respected that. As they worked, the woman sat on a chair near the door. Her eyes followed their movements, not with fear, but with watchfulness. She corrected them when they misunderstood a connection. She explained small details that would otherwise be missed. She was calm, clear, precise. One officer realized she spoke like someone who had repeated this story many times in her head. Maybe to the walls. Maybe to herself. Hours passed without anyone noticing. The outside noise faded. The sun shifted, casting new shadows across the room. The wall seemed to change under the light, revealing details that were harder to see before. At one point, an officer stopped and looked at her. Why now? He asked. Why didn't this come out earlier? She took a deep breath. Because earlier, no one wanted to listen, she said. Now, someone finally looked. That answer carried no bitterness, only truth. As the evening approached, the mood changed again. The discovery was no longer just surprising. It was dangerous. They knew that once this information moved upward, it could not be controlled. Some would want it buried again. Others would want to use it. One of the officers asked her if she was afraid. She thought about it. Fear visited me a long time ago, she said. It stopped staying when I decided to remember instead of forget. They offered to move her to a safer place, just in case. She refused gently. This house was not just shelter. It was a witness. Leaving it felt like abandoning the truth itself. They did not force her before leaving. One officer turned back toward the wall. If this changes everything, he said, are you ready for what comes next? She stood up slowly. I have been ready for years, she replied. When they finally stepped outside, the street looked the same as it always did. Children played. A shopkeeper closed his shutters. Life continued, unaware of the weight that had just shifted. Inside the house, the woman locked the door again. She leaned against it for a moment, letting out a breath she did not realize she was holding. Her heart felt heavy, but also lighter than it had in years. She returned to the inner room and stood before the wall. She touched one corner gently as if thanking it. The wall had done its job. It had waited. It had spoken. That night, for the first time in a long while. She slept without dreaming, and somewhere beyond that quiet street, the truth she had guarded so carefully had begun to move. The next morning, the woman woke with the sunlight spilling gently across the floor. Her house was quiet again, but the memory of yesterday lingered in the air like a shadow she could not shake. She moved slowly, her body remembering the weight of the previous day. Her hands were still slightly trembling, but her mind was calm, sharper than it had been in years. She knew the discovery could not be undone, and yet she felt a strange sense of relief. The wall had finally been seen. Outside, the city was waking up. The streets carried the ordinary rhythm of life, but inside her home, a storm of thoughts was building. She walked to the kitchen and boiled water for tea, her movements automatic like she had done this 1,000 times. Yet her eyes kept drifting to the inner room, to the wall. She could not leave it alone. It had been silent for decades, and now it spoke through others. The officers had returned early in the morning. They needed to verify details. They needed to ask questions that only she could answer. She greeted them with the same calm she always carried, though there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. She wanted to know what they had learned overnight. Did they understand the weight of what she had preserved? They stepped into the room carefully, like entering a sacred place. The photographs, notes, and clippings hung in their quiet order. The strings connecting them made invisible lines, telling stories that had been hidden from the world. One officer touched a photograph gently, his eyes narrowing in concentration. He began to speak in low tones to his colleagues, explaining what he thought he saw. Comparing notes from their previous investigation, she listened, correcting small errors, adding details that only someone who had witnessed the events could know. She described the people in the photographs, where they were at the time, and why their presence mattered. She did not boast or claim heroism. She simply spoke the truth she had watched for so long. Hoping someone would finally hear, the officers began piecing together a story that stretched back decades. They were shocked at the depth of her knowledge, the accuracy of her records, and the bravery required to maintain them all this time. It was clear now that she had been more than a bystander. She had been a witness, a silent guardian of truth. The documents, photographs, and notes were evidence, but also a testament to her endurance and courage. One officer finally asked the question that had been pressing in the air for hours. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" She looked at him, her eyes steady. "I tried," she said softly. "I spoke, but no one listened." Doors closed. People turned away. Threats came quietly and the world moved on. I realized the only way to survive was to preserve it quietly, where it could wait until someone was ready to see. He nodded, understanding, but not fully. Some truths take a lifetime to accept. The woman's story was heavy, yet it carried no bitterness. She had learned long ago that anger fades, but truth endures. As the morning passed, one officer stepped closer to the wall and studied a series of letters pinned carefully in one corner. They were faded, written in a delicate script, describing conversations, events, and small observations. The letters revealed connections that had never been made public, links between people and actions that had remained hidden. The officer realized that this quiet woman had uncovered a network of events that others had ignored or tried to erase. The woman noticed the realization on his face. She did not speak immediately. She let the moment linger, allowing them to see what she had always known. Truth has a way of revealing itself when someone is patient enough to notice. She began to tell the story behind one particular photograph. It was a simple street scene, unremarkable to most, but the photograph showed something that had been erased from public records. She described the day it was taken, the people involved, and the events that followed. She told it calmly, as if she were recounting a memory of another person. The officers listened, captivated. The ordinary had become extraordinary because it held the truth. One of the officers took notes, careful to capture the details she provided. Another officer took photographs of the wall, preserving the arrangement as she had created it. They worked with care, as if disturbing anything could erase the meaning. She moved slowly around the room, pointing out connections. One photograph led to a note, which connected to another document pinned nearby. She showed how the events tied together, how small actions had led to consequences that were still felt today. Her voice was quiet, but each word carried weight. She was teaching them, guiding them through decades of hidden history at one point. An officer stepped back and asked about her personal experience. "How did you survive all these years carrying this alone?" She paused, thinking carefully. "By remembering," she said. "By keeping quiet when I needed to, speaking when I could. By trusting that truth has a way of being seen, even if it takes time. I lived quietly, but I never stopped paying attention. The wall was my companion, my record, my hope." The officers were silent, absorbing the gravity of her words. This was not just evidence. It was a life lived in service to truth. They realized how much courage it must have taken to endure decades of being ignored and still preserve everything so meticulously. One officer asked her if she feared for her safety now. She considered the question. Fear is a companion I have known, she said, but it no longer controls me. I have carried truth longer than fear. If danger comes, it will find me ready. If truth survives, it survives. They continued to work late into the day, documenting every detail. They asked questions about small discrepancies, dates, and people mentioned in the notes. The woman provided answers patiently, clarifying and explaining. She showed them how minor details mattered, how a forgotten name or a miswritten date could change everything. She shared stories behind certain letters. Some were written by people who trusted her with secrets they could not tell anyone else. Others were notes she had written herself after witnessing events that no one would believe. Each item on the wall had meaning, and she ensured that they understood the weight of each one. Hours passed. The sunlight shifted across the room, highlighting photographs and notes in a way that seemed to emphasize their importance. The officers felt the passage of time differently here. This room existed outside the ordinary flow of the city. It held history, memory, and unspoken truths. As evening approached, one officer asked her what she hoped would happen next. She looked at the wall, tracing lines with her fingers. I hope that what was hidden will finally be recognized, she said. That people who need to see it will. That justice, long delayed, may still be served. That the world will remember, even if it took decades to look. They prepared to leave for the night, but the mood had shifted. They were no longer there simply to gather information. They were witnesses, carrying a piece of history that had been preserved in silence. The woman had guided them through it with calm and clarity. She had survived, and now the story would continue beyond her walls as they stepped outside. The city lights began to glow, casting long shadows along the street. Life continued, unaware of the quiet history contained within that small house. But inside, the woman stood before her wall once more, touching a photograph gently, and whispering a quiet acknowledgement to the years she had spent waiting. The wall had survived decades of silence. Now, it had begun to speak, and there was no turning back. The story that had been hidden in plain sight for so long was finally awake, ready to ripple beyond the confines of the home where it had waited. The following morning began quietly, but the woman felt the tension that had settled over her home. She moved with her usual care, making tea and checking the small tasks that kept her life in order. The previous days had changed something. Her wall, once a silent companion, had awakened the curiosity of people who had power to act. And that change carried weight she could feel in every room. The officers returned again, this time with more urgency. Their movements were brisk, but their eyes betrayed caution. They had spent hours reviewing what they had documented the night before. Something about the wall and the stories it contained had awakened questions that reached beyond her small house. Their mission was no longer simple. They needed to understand not only the past, but also what it meant for today. She welcomed them with quiet grace, offering tea without speaking. The men accepted, but their minds were elsewhere, focused on the documents, photographs, and notes that had changed the ordinary house into a room of history. One officer moved carefully, almost reverently, pointing out details that had not been clear before. Each line, each photograph, each string connecting one piece to another, told a story that was far deeper than anyone could have guessed. She began to explain connections that were subtle, almost invisible. The wall was not just a record of events, but a map of relationships, a trace of consequences that had long been ignored. The officers leaned closer, listening as she described actions, reactions, and hidden patterns. Each piece seemed to breathe, revealing the depth of her attention and memory. One officer finally asked what she feared most. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the wall, at the photographs and letters that had been her companions through years of solitude. She saw the faces of people she had known and lost, events that had shaped her life, and truths that had been buried. She finally said, "I feared the world would forget. I feared that no one would ever see what I saw." The officers absorbed the weight of her words. This was not just about facts or evidence. It was about memory, justice, and human responsibility. The woman had lived quietly, but she had witnessed truths that others had chosen to ignore. Now, Those truths could not remain hidden. As the day unfolded, messages began arriving from higher authorities. Some voices wanted the information contained in the wall to remain confidential. Others insisted it must be shared, believing the truth could not be contained any longer. The officers were caught in a tension between orders and conscience. They understood the importance of the evidence in front of them and feared. What might happen if it was suppressed again? The woman watched them carefully. She understood the pressures, but she was unmoved. She had lived decades in quiet observation. The opinions of the world no longer frightened her. She simply pointed out facts, corrected assumptions, and reminded them that what was on the wall was not just paper and photographs, it was the memory of lives, decisions, and consequences. The officers began discussing among themselves how to handle the situation. Some suggested documenting and filing the information quietly. Others argued that the world needed to know that the truth deserved exposure. She listened to their debate, her presence calm, her eyes steady. She had waited for years, and she knew patience would guide the next steps. One officer asked if she feared retaliation. She shook her head. "I have already survived what most would call danger. I am not afraid of the world. I am only concerned that the truth remains intact." The discussion shifted to safety. The officers expressed concern for her, suggesting that she'll move or take precautions. She declined gently. Her home was her witness. Leaving it would feel like abandoning decades of preservation. "I am safe here," she said simply. "This is where truth lives." As afternoon turned into evening, they returned to studying the wall. The officers began connecting dots they had missed the day before. Each discovery deepened their respect for the woman. They realized that her wall had not just preserved events, it had created a narrative that linked hidden actions to visible consequences. The more they examined, the clearer it became that her life had been spent in service to memory, justice, and vigilance. At one point, one officer asked about specific letters and notes. She described how each had come into her possession, who had trusted her with them, and why she had kept them hidden from public view. Some had been copied by hand because the originals were lost or destroyed. She had recreated them from memory, knowing that truth must survive even if physical evidence was threatened. The officers were struck by her patience and meticulousness. Every item was placed with purpose. Nothing was random. The wall itself was a testament to resilience and foresight. They realized that her silence had been strategic, not passive. She had waited for the right time, and that moment had finally arrived. Outside the house, the city continued in its ordinary rhythm. People walked, children played, vendors shouted their prices. Life seemed unaware of the extraordinary events unfolding behind a simple door. Inside, the house held decades of untold stories, each waiting to be recognized, each demanding acknowledgement. One officer turned to her and asked, "Do you think the world is ready for this?" She looked at him with quiet certainty. "It does not matter if the world is ready," she said. "Truth does not ask permission. It exists whether we are prepared or not. The world will have to face it eventually." Night fell, and the officers prepared to leave. They had gathered what they needed, but the impact of the wall weighed on them more heavily than any paperwork. They were no longer just investigators. They were witnesses to a life spent in unwavering devotion to truth. They had seen the past preserved in ways they had never imagined. The woman remained in the inner room after they left. She walked slowly along the wall, touching photographs, letters, and notes. She whispered names, remembered faces, and recounted silent conversations. The room felt alive, vibrating with decades of memory, patience, and endurance. She understood that the events set in motion today would ripple far beyond her walls. Her life had been quiet, hidden, and overlooked, but it had prepared her for this moment. She had survived neglect, threats, and erasure. And now the world was beginning to see the truth she had preserved as she finally sat down. Exhaustion settling into her bones, she felt a strange peace. The wall had witnessed everything, and now others had too. The story that had lived in shadows for decades was stepping into the light, and the woman's silent guardian of memory watched as it began to move toward the recognition it deserved. The morning arrived quietly, but the woman felt the weight of change pressing against the walls of her home. The events of the past days had shifted something, not only in her life, but in the lives of those who had come to witness the wall. The truth she had preserved for decades was moving outward now, beyond the small rooms, beyond the street, reaching toward a world that had once ignored her. The officers returned one last time, this time with a sense of finality. They carried their cameras, notebooks, and documents, but there was a new air of reverence in their movements. They no longer saw her merely as a witness. They saw her as a keeper of history, someone whose life had been spent quietly in service to truth. Their questions were now more reflective, their attention fully on understanding the depth of what she had preserved. She greeted them with calm dignity, offering tea once more. The room smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. The wall, standing like a monument to years of patience, drew their eyes immediately. They moved closer, studying the photographs, letters, and notes, connecting dots that had long been hidden. Each line of string, each pin, each careful placement spoke of time, endurance, and vigilance. She began to explain the significance of the items in ways that went beyond simple fact. She told stories of the people in the photographs, their lives, their choices, the moments they had unknowingly created. She spoke not with anger or resentment, but with a clarity that made the past live vividly for those who had only glimpsed it before. The officers listened intently, understanding for the first time the full scale of her efforts. They asked about the letters she had received over the years. She described how each one had arrived, often in secrecy, carrying confessions, warnings, or small pieces of forgotten truth. Some were from people who feared speaking aloud. Others were from friends long gone. She had preserved them all, never losing hope that one day they would matter. The wall was more than a collection of paper. It was the memory of voices silenced and stories ignored. One officer finally asked the question that had been lingering in the air for days. "What do you hope will happen now?" She looked at the wall, tracing the lines connecting photographs and notes. "I hope the world sees what has been hidden, that those who were wronged are remembered, that the consequences of actions long past are acknowledged, and that the truth once buried finally breathes." The officers nodded, understanding that they were part of something much larger than themselves. They were carriers of her trust, responsible for ensuring that the decades of hidden history would not be lost again. They documented, photographed, and copied, but they did so with care, knowing the gravity of their task. As the day wore on, the woman reflected on the years she had spent in quiet vigilance. She remembered the moments when she had felt hopeless, the times she had feared being forgotten, and the nights she had questioned whether her efforts mattered. Yet here she was, decades later, witnessing the truth she had preserved finally moving beyond her walls. It was a quiet triumph, tempered by the knowledge that recognition often comes slowly. But it was real. News began to travel through the official channels. Higher authorities reviewed the evidence, some with skepticism, others with urgency. The wall had opened doors to investigations long closed, questions long ignored. The woman had not sought fame or reward, but she now understood that her actions could ignite change. The truth she had nurtured quietly could influence decisions, correct misunderstandings, and give voice to the silenced. The officers returned to her home multiple times over the following days, each visit bringing new developments. They shared what they had learned, what others were saying, and how her wall had impacted broader investigations. She listened, absorbing the information with a calm resolve. The world was finally beginning to respond to her. Decades of patience. She began to receive messages from people who had once doubted her or ignored her warnings. Some apologized. Others sought guidance. A few approached cautiously, unsure if they could trust what they had long dismissed. The woman welcomed them all with quiet patience. She had lived long enough to understand the weight of trust, the power of truth, and the importance of careful listening. Her days, once marked by quiet routine, became filled with purpose. She guided inquiries, clarified details, and shared memories that only she could provide. The wall remained central, a living testament to endurance, memory, and vigilance. She moved along it each day, checking the placement of photographs, adjusting notes, and ensuring that the story remained coherent and accurate. It was not just history. It was a record of human experience, meticulously preserved. The officers continued to be her companions in this process. They respected her knowledge, valued her guidance, and treated her home with the reverence it deserved. They realized that the woman was not simply a witness to the past. She was a teacher, guiding them through the lessons embedded in her life and her wall. Slowly, the world began to take notice. Investigations reopened. Questions long unasked were now being posed. Historical records were revisited, and the connections the woman had documented gained credibility. The wall had become more than a private testament. It had transformed into a catalyst for recognition, accountability, and understanding. She did not seek recognition for herself. Her satisfaction came from seeing the impact of her preservation, knowing that the efforts of decades had not been in vain. She had lived quietly, endured, and waited. And now the world was beginning to honor the truth she had safeguarded. Evenings returned to her home, the sense of calm and reflection. She would walk slowly along the wall, touching photographs and notes, whispering names and stories to herself. Each interaction reminded her of the years she had lived in patience, the moments of fear and doubt, and the quiet resilience that had carried her through. She felt a deep peace, knowing that the wall had finally spoken to those who were ready to listen. The officers often returned to consult her. She welcomed their presence. She did not feel the weight of loneliness as she had before. Her home, once a silent witness to decades of hidden truths, had become a hub of careful acknowledgement and emerging recognition. The wall, central to this transformation, remained a testament to the power of endurance, memory, and quiet courage. As months passed, the impact of the wall's revelations grew. Public records were corrected, forgotten stories were acknowledged, and individuals who had been affected by past events received attention long delayed. The woman's life, once marked by solitude and silence, became intertwined with a broader narrative of recognition and justice. She continued to live simply, yet each day carried a profound sense of accomplishment and fulfillment. She often sat quietly, gazing at the wall. The photographs, letters, and notes seemed to breathe with renewed life. Their presence, a reminder of the resilience of memory and the enduring importance of truth. The woman understood that her efforts had transcended personal preservation. They had become a gift to the world, ensuring that the stories once hidden could now be acknowledged and learned from. One evening, as the sun set and the room was bathed in a soft golden light, she sat before the wall and whispered a quiet acknowledgement to the decades she had spent preserving it. She had waited patiently, endured fear, and carried the weight of truth. Now, the world was finally ready to see what she had kept safe. Her life, once quiet and solitary, had become a testament to courage, patience, and the enduring power of truth. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the story she had protected for so long, the woman felt a profound peace. The wall had spoken. The world had begun to listen. And she knew, finally, that her years of endurance had not been in vain. Weeks had passed since the wall had begun to speak to the world, and the woman's small home had changed in ways she had never expected. The quiet routine that had defined her life was now filled with visitors who came to learn, to witness, or simply to understand the story she had preserved. Some came with curiosity, others with questions, and a few with intentions she could not yet gauge. But she welcomed them all with the calm patience that had defined her life. She moved through her home with purpose, guiding people to the inner room where the wall stood. Every photograph, letter, and note had a story, and she told them carefully, never rushing, never exaggerating. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying decades of lived experience and careful observation. She made it clear that this was not a story to entertain, but a record of truth that demanded respect. The wall itself had become a living entity in her home. People would stand before it, tracing lines with their eyes, noticing connections that had been invisible to the world for so long. The room was filled with murmurs of recognition, surprise, and sometimes sorrow. Some visitors would pause, overwhelmed by the weight of what had been preserved. Others would take notes, determined to carry the information beyond the walls of her home. She noticed how the room changed the visitors. People who arrived skeptical or indifferent often left humbled, their perspective altered by the meticulous records and the human stories contained within. The wall had a way of speaking beyond words, revealing the resilience, courage, and patience of someone who had lived in quiet vigilance for decades. One afternoon, two visitors arrived with cameras and notebooks, representing a group that had long studied historical events but had never seen evidence like this. They asked her to walk them through the wall, to explain the connections and the significance of each item. She did so patiently, pointing out the subtleties, explaining the context, and clarifying what others had overlooked. Her explanations were clear, simple, and grounded in lived experience. She did not embellish or dramatize. She presented truth as it was. The visitors were struck by the precision of her records. Dates, names, locations, and events were all meticulously documented. They realized that her decades of careful observation had created a resource that could not be ignored. They asked how she had managed to maintain this level of accuracy for so long. She simply smiled and said, "I had no choice but to pay attention. Truth does not wait, and neither did I." As they continued to study the wall, one visitor asked about her life beyond the documents. She spoke briefly, sharing glimpses of quiet days, small joys, and the patience required to preserve what most had forgotten. She described how she had learned to live with solitude, not as a punishment, but as a necessity to protect the truth. Her story resonated deeply with her visitors, reminding them that courage often exists in quiet, unseen forms. Later that day, another visitor arrived, someone connected to a larger investigation into events the wall documented. The visitor brought questions that went beyond the surface, seeking insight into the motivations, decisions, and consequences that had shaped the events over decades. She answered carefully, ensuring that her responses were accurate and respectful of those involved. She did not speculate or judge. She presented what she had witnessed and preserved. The presence of these visitors brought new energy into her home. Conversations moved from observation to reflection. People began to connect the dots, understanding how past actions had ripple effects that continued into the present. They asked her how she had endured the burden of knowledge alone for so long. She paused, thinking about decades of solitude and vigilance. "I endured because truth has its own momentum," she said. "It waits, it persists, and eventually it calls to be seen." Evenings became moments of quiet reflection. She would sit before the wall, tracing the photographs and letters with her fingers, whispering names and stories softly to herself. The room seemed to breathe with her, holding the memory of decades and the presence of those who came to witness. She felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that the wall had finally begun to fulfill its purpose. As the weeks turned into months, news of her wall spread further. Scholars, historians, and journalists visited to learn from the records she had kept. Each visitor added a new layer of attention and respect, ensuring that the stories preserved in her home would be shared responsibly and accurately. She became a quiet guide, teaching people not only about historical events but about patience, endurance, and the human capacity to bear witness. She also received letters from individuals whose families had been affected by the events. Some expressed gratitude, others shared their own stories of loss or survival. She read each letter carefully, understanding the connections and sometimes offering gentle advice or comfort. Her role had evolved from silent preserver to an intermediary. Between the past and those seeking understanding in the present, the wall continued to grow in significance. Researchers would spend hours examining the connections, consulting her explanations, and cross-referencing her meticulous notes. Each item became a point of discussion, a piece of a larger puzzle that was slowly being recognized. She watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing that her work had survived the tests of time, neglect, and skepticism. Visitors began to notice patterns in her life as well. They asked how she had maintained clarity and focus despite isolation. She explained that attention, patience, and a dedication to truth were practices she had cultivated over decades. She had learned to prioritize observation over distraction, patience over impulse, and understanding over judgment. Her life had been ordinary in many ways, but extraordinary in its commitment to witnessing and recording. One day, an officer who had been part of the early discovery returned with colleagues. They expressed awe at how the wall had grown in influence and impact. They discussed the broader consequences, recognizing that her preservation of truth had far-reaching implications. She listened calmly, acknowledging the changes, but emphasizing that the purpose was never recognition, it was responsibility. The world had been given the chance to understand. She had done her part. Even as her home filled with activity, she maintained her quiet routines. Tea in the morning, small tasks around the house, and evenings spent in reflection. The wall remained the center, not just of attention, but of meaning. It symbolized decades of patience, courage, and the commitment to truth that had defined her life. Through the months, she came to see how her work had inspired others. Visitors often left motivated to preserve their own histories, to observe carefully, and to act with integrity. She understood that her life had become a model not for fame or recognition, but for the quiet power of vigilance and the enduring value of truth. Her wall had begun as a personal act of preservation and grown into a beacon for those who sought understanding. As the sun set one evening, she sat in her favorite chair, gazing at the wall. Each photograph, each letter, each note seemed to hum with life. The stories, long hidden, had begun to reach the world. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that decades of waiting and vigilance had not been in vain. The truth she had protected was now moving outward, touching lives and shaping understanding. Her home, once a quiet refuge, had become a hub of memory, knowledge, and respect. The woman, who had lived in solitude for so long, now realized that her life had created ripples that extended far beyond her walls. Her patience, endurance, commitment to truth had made a lasting impact. As she rose and walked slowly along the wall, she whispered a quiet acknowledgement to the decades she had preserved. Names, faces, and events echoed softly in the room, a testament to a life lived in quiet courage. She understood that her work was not finished, but she also knew that the wall had begun to fulfill its purpose. The stories would continue to be told, remembered and honored, and she, the guardian of truth, had ensured that they would never be forgotten, and in that quiet, luminous moment, the woman felt the profound satisfaction of a life well lived, dedicated to memory, truth, and the quiet endurance that had finally brought the hidden stories into the light.